As a journalistic critic, I have two principal jobs. The first job is, in the process of writing a review, I figure out what it is I think about the work. I don't come to a show and look around and have some kind of experience and then run back to the office and sit down at the computer and explain what that experience was. That's not writing, that's typing. That's just reportage. Instead, when I see a show, usually the first thing I do, I bring a notebook, have a pencil. First thing I do is go around the room and count the number of works. I count the number of paintings, the number of works on paper, the number of photographs, write it down. It's a fairly mundane and tedious thing to do, but it's a way in which I begin to focus on what's here. I've found in the past that when you walk into the door of a gallery, you're bringing all kinds of assumptions with you. And the hardest thing to do is to start weeding that stuff out and just look at what's there in front of you. Just visually look at what's there in front of you. And then once I've counted everything in the room and I know exactly how many things there are, since I work for a newspaper, one of the things I have to do is report facts. Once I get all the factual stuff done, then I just start making random notes about what I'm looking at. And I just write. I just write and write and write. I can usually spend no more than an hour in an exhibition, and it doesn't matter whether it's this size or whether it's a show of 200 works in the LA County Museum or Metropolitan Museum. After an hour, I'm exhausted. I can't pay attention anymore. So that's usually my limit in a show. I have a notebook full of chicken scratchings. I take that back to the office and I put it in my desk. And 9 times out of 10, I don't look at it again. The process of taking notes is the process of taking the next step and focusing on what I'm seeing and what I'm thinking about. And then I sit down to write. And that's the beginning of the second part of my job, which is, as I'm trying to figure out what it is I think about what I've seen, that's my job as a critic. Then my job as a writer is to find a way in which to bring the reader into that process of discovery with me. If I write a review that no one's going to read, I might as well not have written the review. So for me, success or failure in writing a column is not whether or not I got it right, whether or not what I've written corresponds to what Tim Rollins and KOS had in mind. Success or failure to me in writing a column is whether a person who reads the first paragraph reads it all the way to the end. That's my job as a writer. And I think it's, in certain respects, can be related to an artist's job as an artist, to make works of art that you spend time with. Americans typically think that, when they think of art at all, that it's something that people used to make in Europe or in some other time and place very far away, mostly for emperors and popes and such, and other rich and powerful types. By the time emperors and popes stopped demanding that sculptures and paintings be made to decorate palaces and churches, the conventional wisdom goes, artists had gone crazy like Van Gogh, or they'd begun to make crazy art like Picasso. Americans almost never think of art as something made in America, except maybe by Norman Rockwell, who painted swell covers for old magazines and calendars. Or that guy, what was his name, Andrew Wyeth, who painted a crippled woman sprawled out in the grass in a rolling field with a big old house on the horizon. Oh, and maybe, just maybe, Georgia O'Keeffe. That about wraps it up. Now, I'm well aware that lots of public polls and surveys taken these days show big increases in membership and attendance at art museums. But that, I think, is a factor of something else entirely. That's a factor of the entertainment culture that increasingly characterizes American life. The decline of an industrial manufacturing base and the rise of new technologies in the last many years led us to think that we were entering a new society, which we optimistically began to call the information society. But it hasn't really turned out that way. The information society is really the entertainment society, or if you want to be generous, the infotainment society. Museums are indeed packing in the customers, but it is not for shows on difficult subjects, nor for citizens who are eager to have time to spend in permanent collection galleries where they can linger over Southeast Asian bronzes or savor the finest in conceptual art of the 1970s. Museums are mainly packing in customers for blockbuster exhibitions, for Monet and virtually anything with the word impressionist in the title, for Matisse, Van Gogh, and Picasso, and for any of the once-in-a-lifetime gatherings called the treasures of this or the gold of that. These blockbusters, which, mind you, are sometimes very good, very worthwhile exhibitions to have organized and to see, are primarily event-driven experiences. In essence, they're not all that much different from the event-driven product that dominates Hollywood movies today. One person's Van Gogh exhibition is probably that same person's Titanic. The entertainment is, in a very real sense, interchangeable. It's the search for a spectacular event, not a soul-hungry craving for art, that is bringing people in the museum door. It's also true that the art market, and more specifically the auction market, has become something of a spectator sport in the last 10 or 15 years, with the general public now watching with detached bemusement the sale of Impressionists, Van Goghs, and Picassos for sums of money that even exceed the expenditures for first-round draft picks in professional basketball. But like I say, the market-watching game is akin to sport. It's another form of entertainment. And besides, it's business, and we know what the business of America is. If Americans really believed that art was something of critical importance to understanding the strange journey that we human beings take from the cradle to the grave, every public school student in America would be studying art. Parents would demand it. Vernacular American slang would say that a good, solid, basic education for every child has 4 R's, not 3. There'd be reading, writing, arithmetic, and art. But there isn't. And as educational reforms today grapple with the huge task of attempting to save our crumbling schools, art is not likely to go to the head of the curriculum anytime soon. Now, there is a standard explanation for why Americans don't like art. And while I don't believe it gets to the core of the matter, it does get us into the vicinity. The standard explanation is that the nation was founded on the rock of Puritan values, and Puritan values are iconoclastic. Puritan iconoclasm opposed the religious use of images, and the religious use of images was the main use that images had in Europe for the preceding 1,000 years. This was especially so in Southern Europe, where the Catholic Church was the great patron for art. But Puritans were from the North, where the use of imagery was a bit more conflicted. The devil's work, some insisted, in Protestant denunciations of art's corrupting influence, sentiments whose living legacy we witnessed just a few years back in widely publicized attacks against the National Endowment for the Arts. No one should be surprised that the attack against the NEA was led by fundamentalist Protestants, the Reverend Donald Wildman, the Reverend Jerry Falwell, and their allies in the Congress. What is less widely considered is that almost without exception, the artists who were the targets of those blistering attacks, Robert Mapplethorpe, Karen Finley, Andre Serrano, and the rest, had all been raised Catholics. Of course, the art that Mapplethorpe, Finley, and Serrano were making was certainly not art that was made to promote Catholic doctrine. But these artists, just like Italian Baroque painters of the Counter-Reformation era, knew full well the potential power that imagery can wield. In fact, the potential for abuse of imagistic power was the subject of Andre Serrano's now notorious photograph, Piss Christ. Let's talk for a moment about that photograph. There's no need for me even to put a slide of it up on the screen, so familiar is the image as an icon of the NEA wars. It's lodged in our collective consciousness. Piss Christ was made in 1987. The first time I saw it was at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, in an exhibition of emerging artists the following year, in the summer of 1988. A big 5-foot Cibachrome, it had not yet acquired the national notoriety that was about to engulf it. And frankly, I didn't pay very much attention to the photograph. Piss Christ was one of several flashy images by the artist, pictures that reminded me of slick advertisements, the kind you might find on those lit from behind boxes that you find on urban bus shelters. The work's clout was propelled not by content, but by technique and style. Bright, saturated, sometimes lurid colors, big, attention-grabbing size, simple, uncomplicated imagery, a kind of cool, laminated look that was achieved by attaching the photograph with silicone to a clear sheet of plexiglass. In fact, Serrano's photographs seemed to me a bit desperate in their calculated effort to seduce, like an advertisement. Their sense of calculation extended to their subject matter. A picture of a dog hanging by the neck from a rope, a plastic crucifix, a crimson-red pool of blood. The subjects of these photographs referred to a litany of highly topical subjects of the day: the pervasive violence of American society, the rise of born-again Christianity, the innocently tainted blood of the AIDS epidemic. It was not the showy, look-at-me calculation of Serrano's art that was bothersome, but rather the illustrational obviousness of its rhetoric. So I didn't give Serrano's photographs a second thought. Not that is until 10 months later, in the spring of 1989, when I watched wide-eyed with the rest of the country as the Reverend Donald Wildman, a conservative evangelical minister from Tupelo, Mississippi, and the founder of the old National Federation of Decency, lit out after Serrano as if he were the devil incarnate and Piss Christ the gaping maw of hell. What could Wildman and his friends in Congress possibly have found in Serrano's flashy but rather fatuous photograph to incite such evil-minded wrath? The charge that they lodged against Serrano was, of course, blasphemy against the Christian faith. But for me, Serrano's photograph was about something else entirely. The ability of a camera to lie, falsify, fabricate, and mislead, all in the most glamorous and convincing way, is the artistic pivot around which Serrano's art turns, just as it is for many other artists who work with photography. Camera images conceal at least as much as they reveal, a condition that is long since a given for postmodern art. As for spiritual blasphemy, Piss Christ does speak ill, but it speaks ill of the camera's capacity to lie, even in the face of a sacred subject. As a picture, the photograph is all slick Technicolor splendor, achieved in the controlled environment of the artist's studio, in exactly the same way that it is at Paramount, Universal, or MGM, which is to say with the aid of props, carefully orchestrated lighting, and colored gels. The background field of the photograph, of the radiant altar-sized photograph, is a deep, rich crimson. The crucifixion rising before it is irradiated with a golden glow. Tiny bubbles proliferate across the picture's surface, as if the tortured body of Christ is being seen submerged in the translucent blood of his spectacular passion. In fact, I would submit to you that unless you know in advance the title of the photograph or the artist's method of making it, that there is absolutely nothing about Piss Christ that could possibly offend. There is virtually nothing that meets your eye in this image that tells you that the picture was made by photographing a carefully lit dime store plastic crucifix propped inside a small glass container filled with the artist's urine. This extra visual revelation of the subject's actual tawdriness and debasement, a revelation that comes only with knowing the title and perhaps by doing some investigation into how the picture was made, is critical to Serrano's enterprise. He wants you to be visually tempted, visually seduced, visually taken in by a sacred image. Hence his use of slick modern styles associated with Hollywood and advertising. Then, upon further inquiry, he wants you to be smacked across the face with the sorry news of what actually went on behind the camera's duplicitous lens. Now, why would Serrano want such a thing? Why would he want you to be seduced, then abandoned? Especially in regard to camera images associated with Christianity. Well, remember, Piss Christ was made in 1987. That was the banner year for public exposure of shocking humiliations in a brand new form of religious enterprise, one that was based on the deceptive power of the camera. I'm talking, of course, about the new phenomenon of evangelical ministries on television, which had blossomed in the previous 10 years into very rich, very powerful empires. In 1987, though, televangelism was teetering on the brink of total collapse in the wake of a series of trashy sex and money scandals. As vulgar stories of hypocrisy and even criminality were unfolding in the press, the entire nation was held in thrall. For months, the center of the modern media circus was held by Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. The pair were dragged blubbering from their lofty throne atop television's PTL club by Jimmy Swaggart, their pious rival in the televised fire and brimstone trade. Jim Baker was soon convicted of fraud and sent up the river, while Tammy Faye was sent to a rehab clinic. In no time at all, Jimmy Swaggart himself was sent packing with prostitute problems of his own. From the sidelines, Jerry Falwell was scolding the other's antics, and he even briefly took the reins of PTL, but soon he resigned, wary of the taint. And finally, a fitting send-off to 1987 was given by Oral Roberts, the father of the lucrative television ministry idea. Roberts claimed that God had whispered into his ear that he was going to die. Unless, of course, dedicated television viewers stuffed $8 million in donations into envelopes and mailed them to his headquarters in Tulsa by the end of the year. This is the context within which Andre Serrano made his photograph. Piss Christ is a reflection on these brazen goings-on. It shows a gorgeous and seductive image of faith and redemption that, on closer inspection, was actually fabricated from filth. The picture blasphemes neither God nor the Christian Savior. It does speak ill of media-manipulated ministries like the Bakers, Swaggarts, Falwells, and Roberts, which were exploiting the incomparable reach and authority of the camera to lie and extort in the name of spiritual salvation, and on a scale that would make Elmer Gantry blush. Now, interestingly enough, one of the leading bashers of the National Endowment for the Arts was also Catholic. Pundit and periodic presidential candidate Patrick J. Buchanan. But Buchanan's objection to the NEA had more to do with larger questions of American morality, with a retreat of morality based in Judeo-Christian religious tradition, and with the rise and pervasiveness of a secular humanism. When Buchanan mounted the podium at the Republican National Convention in Houston in 1992 and announced that a culture war was underway in the United States, it was a war with distinctly religious features. Protestant iconoclasts, conservative Catholics, and followers of any other established Western religious doctrine were called to arms by Buchanan for a new crusade, launched in a glorious effort to defeat the secular barbarian hordes. So I think there's a good deal of truth to the assertion that American Puritanism is at the root of American distaste for art. I grew up in Massachusetts in one of those quintessential picture postcard towns with a village square surrounded by churches and a statue of a Minuteman in the middle. And there the legacy of Jonathan Edwards remained strong, or at least it was when I was young. When I was a junior in high school, around 1966, I began to learn of the American distrust of the arts. My extracurricular drama coach advised me that, in addition to thinking about going on to a liberal arts college after high school graduation, I ought to give serious thought instead to an alternative. He believed that I had a certain talent and that I should enroll in drama school. My parents, when told of this advice, reacted with an unhesitant and not at all unexpected no. There were a couple of reasons for this. By the mid-1960s, a liberal arts college education had become a kind of middle-class grail for post-war Americans. So, by insisting that I avail myself of that opportunity, my parents were simply helping to ensure that someday their youngest son might have a career rather than just a job. A liberal arts degree would also give a young man something to, quote, fall back on, in the parlance of the day, just in case other, rather more eccentric life plans failed to materialize. The very idea that working in theater could itself be a serious, meaningful, sustaining activity for an adult was certainly considered eccentric. And as I would later learn, not just in the small New England town where I grew up, but in most nooks and crannies of the United States as well. That was not, however, the only reason my parents responded in the negative. Although Mom and Dad never actually said it, never fully elaborated on the slight but unmistakable edge of frowning nervousness that accompanied their refusal of my high school teacher's rash suggestion of drama school, they did make passing, cautious, and memorable mention of, well, you know, those kinds of people that populate the world of the arts. Sensing in my not ready to acknowledge it subconscious that I myself was one of those kinds of people, their comments managed to give me a good case of the willies. On the upside, though, it also gave me an inkling that I was not quite as alone in the world as I had always imagined myself to be. The world of the arts suddenly began to acquire for me a new and compelling attractiveness. My parents' response is my earliest recollection of an encounter with one of the great open secrets of our 20th century cultural life. The open secret is this: Americans casually regard the arts to be a feminine activity, not a masculine one. The arts have a gender, and the gender is female. The assumption never seems to get said out loud, perhaps because it's by now become an elemental ingredient of our national psyche. But the existence of a seemingly natural equation between the arts and femininity is casually learned from childhood. In almost any educational debate, the arts are sooner or later described dismissively as a frill, which is another way of saying the arts are frilly, like a petticoat. The next time you watch an old Our Gang movie on TV, notice how often young Alfalfa, the reluctant mama's boy, would be sneeringly berated by his fellow members of the He-Man Woman Haters Club for practicing the piano rather than perfecting his baseball pitch. Meanwhile, sweet Darla could do her scales with impunity. Ditto Dennis the Menace and Margaret in the funny papers. And on I Love Lucy, how many times did Lucy and Ethel concoct a harebrained scheme to get Ricky to perform for their polite and slightly snobbish ladies' club, which went by the name of the Wednesday Afternoon Fine Arts League? All across America, fine arts leagues have always been organizations for women. When I say Americans regard the arts to be a feminine activity, that is, the province of women and gay men, who we casually regard as being like women, I'm not thinking of popular art, but of high art. Movies, rock and roll, television, advertising, and other forms of pop culture, including Ricky Ricardo's big band singing, are excluded from this genuinely gendered set-aside, and for one overarching reason. Like sports, pop culture has winners and it has losers. Winners and losers can be pretty clearly defined by charts, graphs, and stats. Mass market success is finally measured with accounting devices, not with critical arguments. A significant part of pop culture's value and of its inescapable Americanness can immediately be identified in the very same way that success is measured in any business. And despite some inroads, Americans certainly don't consider business to be a feminine activity. In the United States, art has been gendered female for a very long time. In 1836, Charles Butler wrote an instructional manual for young gentlemen, which warned against too great an interest in the fine arts. Quote, "Ornamental education," he wrote, "and attention to graces has a connection with effeminacy. In acquiring the gentleman, I would not lose the spirit of the man," close quote. In 1916, Marius De Zayas, a Mexican-born artist, critic, and dealer who had worked in Paris with Picasso, and who came to the United States and was associated with the influential Alfred Stieglitz Circle in New York, described the inhabitants of America's art world as, quote, the flowers of artificial breeding. They live in an imaginary and hybrid atmosphere. They have the mentality of homosexuals, unquote. In a 1936 psychological study called Sex and Personality, Studies in Masculinity and Femininity, researchers grouped artists together with clergymen as, quote, the most feminine of the occupational classes, close quote. And in 1971, in an article in the popular magazine Psychology Today, artists are said to be, quote, intensely confused about their sexual identities and roles. The future artist often shows unusual fears, sensibilities, and affinities by the time he's an adolescent. In terms of male-female identification, he already scores high on scales of femininity by the first grade, close quote. Notice that this study assumes that the artist is male, but acts female. Where this distinctly American equation between the arts and femininity came from is a long story, much of which was told by the brilliant cultural historian Anne Douglas in her landmark 1977 study of the Victorian era, titled The Feminization of American Culture. I recommend this book to you, but let me offer a brief and, I'm afraid, woefully oversimplified synopsis of Douglas's central argument. She begins in the late 18th and 19th centuries with the huge and virtually unprecedented transformations of social and cultural life that were being fostered by the Industrial Revolution. A new and distinctly modern idea of home and family began to take shape. Instead of husband and wife as co-equal producers of familial life, as they had been on the farm, their roles began to separate and diverge. Men began to stream into factories where they produced goods. Women stayed at home, venturing out mostly to consume goods for the family. As the industrial juggernaut was picking up steam, power began to shift away from its traditional constituency. And power's traditional constituency was the seat of the church and the landed aristocracy. It was shifting toward this new class of manufacturers. In the process, the 19th century witnessed the dual phenomenon of what Douglas termed clerical disestablishment and feminine disestablishment. What this meant was that the established roles by which the clergy and women had historically enjoyed particular kinds of power had begun to unravel. First, churches were legally separated from their historic pedestal, from which they'd always enjoyed formally sanctioned government privilege. And second, thanks to industrial manufacturing, a woman's historical role as a co-equal partner with her husband in the production of goods and services within the family was informally rendered obsolete. Why stitch a quilt when it was cheaper to buy a blanket? So, what were disestablished clergymen and educated women to do? Left increasingly powerless and insignificant by the stunning transformation of a rural agrarian society into an urban industrial one, they began to exert their authority in the few, mostly marginalized fields left open to them, including literature and the arts. A woman's potential for influence on cultural taste rapidly began to expand as her domestic role shifted away from being a household producer and toward being a household consumer of manufactured products. An identification of the arts with so-called feminine feeling was underway. One pretty good example of how this worked is now enshrined in New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm talking about the famous Havemeyer collection of European painting, which includes a remarkable group of Impressionist pictures. It's one of the great private collections now in an American public museum. Henry O. Havemeyer was a late 19th century industrial baron who provided the money and the ambition to acquire the aristocratic trappings of wealth. His wife, Louisine Havemeyer, provided most of the taste that made that ambition worthwhile. To build their collection of European paintings, the Havemeyers relied on outside advice, including the advice of an American expatriate living and working in Paris. Mary Cassatt, well born to a Philadelphia family, had had to flee the United States for Europe in order to pursue her ambitions. Together, she and Louisine were responsible for assembling much of the now fabled Havemeyer collection and for introducing European modern art into the United States. And of course, it was also women who founded the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, and a woman who founded the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1930. Now, if what I'm suggesting is indeed true, and Americans do regard the arts as a feminine activity and not a masculine one, you might be wondering right about now why it is that male artists are firmly at the top of the American heap, while women artists and openly gay artists still have an uphill climb. Well, the feminization of American culture still takes place in a sexist society, which has created a paradoxical and self-defeating double bind. The dynamic, which is slightly different from the run-of-the-mill repressions of sexism, goes like this. The public world is a masculine arena. Public acknowledgement of the unmanliness of art would thoroughly discredit it. So in order to have any chance of being taken seriously beyond its trivialized sphere, art's socially constructed aura of femininity gets muzzled and suppressed. An exaggerated sense of masculinity is required for art. Take abstract expressionist painting, which in the 1940s and 1950s was post-war America's first real bid for international public stature in art. The stultifying rhetoric of heroic machismo around abstract expressionism was a gross pretension, but it was also necessary given the art's deeply intuitive emphasis on inner feeling and the unconscious. Abstract expressionism made an appeal to an unutterable language of feeling, the language which is at the heart of feminine Victorian sentimentality of the kind that Anne Douglas was describing. A high-powered antidote was thus demanded, and it came in the form of 1 part intellectualized grandiloquence and 2 parts He-Man bravado and butch posturing. So that, in a nutshell, is why I believe most Americans hate art. I'd like to show you some work by 4 young artists who are just emerging in Los Angeles. I want to emphasize that these 4 in no way represent a movement or an overview of the wide range of artistic production going on today. All 4 of them happen to be painters, but they do not constitute a revival of painting. They're just 4 artists whose work I happen to like, and whose work may or may not provide an opportunity to expand on the remarks that I've just made. This is a painting by a young artist named Kurt Kauper, who's 33. a couple years out of school at UCLA. It's called Diva Fiction Number 10. It was painted a couple months ago. It's oil on birch, and it's a life-size figure. The painting is about a little over 7 feet tall and about 4 feet wide. This is Diva Fiction Number 5. He calls them fictions because they are completely fictional. These are people who don't exist. What he does when he puts these pictures together is work in a completely classical figurative manner. He works with a live model, or I should say models, multiple sitters, and he starts with a drawing in which he does a figure drawing of a skeletal figure over which he puts flesh, over which he puts clothing, which then becomes the template for the painting. One of the things I find interesting about them is that they're pretty, I think, straightforward about identifying art as a feminine activity that has exaggerated masculine overtones. The subject of a diva, and I think these paintings, since they're diva paintings, they're obviously based on opera singers, and the image of a diva is an image of a kind of willful, strong, powerful warhorse of an artist. And that kind of power, when expressed by a woman who's an artist, is often regarded as a woman having certain masculine characteristics. And in Kurt Kauper's paintings, the figures have, I think, a distinctly ambiguous sense of gender. Plus, they're amazingly painted. They also kind of cross wires between a very old tradition of painting called grand manner portraiture, a kind of aristocratic tradition that has been dead since the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, which gets fused with a really sort of up-to-the-minute celebrity photography, People magazine kind of slickness, which I think is pretty interesting. This is a different artist. This is a painting called Made to Order from 1998 by a young artist named Monique Prieto. She's 36. And to give you some idea of its scale, it's huge. It's a little over 10 feet long and a little over 7 feet tall. It's painted with acrylic on raw canvas, bare canvas. Everything that's in color is the acrylic. Everything that's in white is raw canvas. This is called Superstars. It's from 1998. It's about 6 feet tall. The surfaces of these paintings, the way the paint is applied, the acrylic paint is applied, is completely uninflected. You have no sense of a brush, a hand. I'm quite mystified as to how she actually does that. This is called Last Chance. It's also 10 feet long. And these are the first abstract paintings that I'm aware of that have the feeling of being cartoons. Most cartoons are figurative. These seem to be abstract cartoons in a weird sense. The way in which these paintings come about is, I think, important to them. She begins by making a drawing on a computer. She uses a Macintosh Painter program on a laptop, and she draws with her finger on the little pad on the laptop. So all of these forms are finger paintings, and she'll play with the color options on the computer to figure out what the color schemes are. And if you look along the bottom edge of the painting, all of the forms sort of flatten out at the bottom, as if they're standing on the bottom edge of the canvas. And one of the strange things about these paintings is that because they stand there almost like personages, almost like these surreal personages, they have a real feeling of density and weight and gravity that is, pulling them down, and they're standing on this edge. But they're completely flat, uninflected, bloodless. It's a very strange sense of being and space, which I think has a lot to do with electronic space of computers in which we live these days. And this is called On the Other Side. It's about 8 feet long. And if any of you are familiar with color field painting from the late 60s, it might remind you a bit of that, of things like Morris Louis Vale paintings. In a Morris Louis Vale painting, Louis would take pigment and pour it onto the canvas and then tilt the canvas and let the paint run down and sort of melt into the raw canvas weave. And then when the painting was unfurled, it had a kind of illusion of nature, of natural processes of flow and color and light. And Monique Prieto's paintings, I think, are sort of consciously made in recognition of that precedent, but completely eradicate nature from the equation. It's a completely artificial sense. This is a painting by an artist named Kevin Appel, who's 32, also just out of school. It's called Bookcase with Paper Lamps, from about 1998. A painting that on first glance looks like a geometric abstraction, and on second glance is a geometric abstraction of a bookcase. It has a similar, to me at any rate, a similar kind of feeling of that empty kind of electronic space rather than a physical space, in which you read the painting both as flat geometric shapes, which is all it is, as well as objects, a bookcase with books and paper lamps. This is called Storage System on a Two-Toned Wall. He works very often from old magazines of 50s houses, principally in Los Angeles, 50s and 60s houses in Los Angeles, kind of those blank modern spaces in which indoors and outdoors are hard to distinguish from one another. This is called louvers. It's a louvered window over a bookcase. This is called Orange Storage. And he's also begun, in addition to doing individual objects within interiors, he's been doing interiors themselves. This is called Interior with Sliding Panels. This is another view of it hanging on the wall to give you an idea of its scale. This is called Landing, and it's a floating staircase with, I don't know, pictures or windows on the wall on the right, probably paintings, and a curtain in the background, a window curtain in the background. And even though the kind of architecture that he makes reference to, the post-war California modernist architecture, sort of epitomized by Richard Neutra and others, that was an architecture that was designed with a kind of idealistic dream of making a perfect suburban home in which you could flourish, in which indoors and outdoors, the healthy outdoors came indoors and indoor living was outdoors, and the perfect nuclear family could have a perfect life. And when Kevin Appel translates that into these sort of abstract, flat, two-dimensional spaces that are filled with light, somehow to me they become kind of ominous and spooky. They have they have a kind of, I don't know, a sort of strange edge to them. This one is called Garden View. And indeed, it's hard to tell what's indoors and what's outdoors here, or whether you're looking at a living room through sliding glass doors to a garden outdoors, or whether you're looking at a mirror that's reflecting something. It's hard to tell where you are, which is very much the way I feel. And then last, I want to show you a series of paintings by Sharon Ellis called The Times of the Day. Sharon Ellis is a little older than the others. She's 43, but she went to art school and then stopped making art for a number of years and started up several years ago. So even though she's slightly older, her career arc is similar to theirs. The Times of the Day is a series of 6 paintings that are in fact the times of the day. Dawn, morning, midday, afternoon, dusk, and night. Alas and alack, I only have 5 of the slides. So we're going to miss the afternoon. This is Dawn. This is 40 inches tall, about 30 inches wide. They're easel paintings, so they're very intimate one-on-one paintings, unlike the others, most of the others that I've shown you, which are bodily scaled to a figure standing in a room. These are much more intimate and one-on-one. It's hard to get 2 people together in front of a painting like this. And she paints, the medium that she uses is alkyd, which is it's a kind of gel, a translucent paint. And she gessos the canvas first. So the color in these paintings is very translucent and light reflective. So given the fact that she's painting the times of the day, light is a pretty important ingredient. This is morning. It took her almost 2 years to paint these 6 paintings. This is midday. This is dusk. And this is called night. This was actually the first painting in the series that she did in 1997. Dusk, the one prior to it, was the last one she painted. She finished it a couple months ago. And obviously, one of the peculiar things about these paintings is their sort of hallucinatory quality. Every one of the pictures is orchestrated in a similar manner, where there's a kind of foreground that's silhouetted against a background sky with a bilateral symmetry that's virtually impossible in nature. So even though natural phenomena seem to be the subject, they're purely artificial. I think of them as landscapes of a kind of perceptual consciousness rather than a physical consciousness. And one of the other peculiar things about them, this is a pretty good example, the skies in a lot of these also allude to physical body parts. This has a sort of feeling of intestines or brain matter. And they're almost like Rorschach blots in a way, where an abstracted image becomes the cue for an imaginative response, but the cue is always comes from a kind of bodily metaphor. And the only exceptions to the rule in her paintings are this one, Dawn, and Dusk, where the background is no longer bilaterally symmetrical. And Dawn and Dusk, of course, are the times of the day when everything's in flux, where change is occurring, the transition from dark to light is occurring, and the possibility of what's going to happen is an open question. During the day, everything's sort of like a tuning fork and sharp and bright, but at these 2 times of day, it's not the case. These are like, I don't know, these are almost like a nervous system, like ganglia. And this is almost ovarian. It's like a diagram of a womb in a way. It has the foreground has this a kind of pubic feel in a way. They're very. I think the body references to a perceptual understanding of consciousness is interesting. So anyhow, thanks very much for coming.